Hi everybody. This week we are going to focus about international politics and the study of international politics in political science, which is international relations. This is for me an exciting week because international relations is my main focus of research and teaching more in general, and something that I'm extremely passionate about as well. So I'm hoping to get you excited about international politics as well, and hopefully in the future you will want to take more classes that has to do with that sub area of political science. So let's get going. Well, so far we've talked about human behavior, how people behave politically. We talked about concepts of political systems and power and different system with their elections and difference between democracies and non-democracies and how people participate in politics and the impact or relationship between the economy and politics. But now, when we are focusing on international politics, you gotta look at this word international, right? You can break it very easily into inter and national, which means it's between nations. Another word to use in this week would be also global politics. So either way, what we are talking about is about interactions between entities that are playing this game of global politics or international politics. Now, because we are talking about entities, it's not always easy to understand exactly what is the unit of analysis that we are looking at. Some of the things that were true for human behavior and human political interactions would still be true for international politics. And in other ways, we are also looking at some ideas and concepts that come from system or organization structures. And hopefully all of that will become clear in the next few minutes. When we're talking about international politics, we're still looking at competition of interests, we're still talking about power and power relations, and about resources. Now, one of the first things that we should identify is who is acting or playing in this game of international politics. In other words, who are the actors that we are looking at? So, there are a number of such actors, but first and foremost are nation states, countries. The United States, France, Australia, Zimbabwe, Gabon, Uruguay, Chile, China, Japan, all of those countries, and we have 193 recognized countries in the world right now. All of them are the main actors of this play of international politics. With them, aside on the side or interacting with them, but also some people will argue now competing with nation states, are international organizations. We call them shortly IOs or IGOs for intergovernmental organizations. What those organizations are collaborative efforts between nation states, and this is why they are intergovernmental organizations. The members of those organizations are countries, nation states, and their governments, and representatives to those organizations work for their home governments. An example, or probably you all heard about, is the United Nations. The United Nations is the largest global intergovernmental organization. And people who are representing Germany in the United Nations are employed by the German government, and they represent the German government. And of course, that is true for each and every country. We'll say more things about international organizations in a few minutes also. Another actor that we should look at are multinational corporations. We call them MNCs or TNCs. TNC stands for transnational corporations. Those are the big, huge, multi-billion-dollar corporations. Think about your Walmart, your Coca-Cola, your Google, that usually have headquarters in one or more countries, but operations all around the globe. And they're very important because of their economic power, because they can bring investment and employment to different countries. We also have a whole group of transnational entities. The difference between international and transnational is that international is between nation states, between countries, or between representatives of countries. When we talk about transnational, we're talking about things that transcend borders. Those actors that you can find their different parts in different countries, and the connections between them are not between governments, but between people, either businesses or social movements or other organizations. So we have NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Think about some big ones, such as Human Rights Watch or Greenpeace, for example. You probably heard those names. Those are organizations that have branches all over the world and a headquarters or some kind of an organizational structure that coordinates their actions all around the world. But they're not dependent on the specific country that they are located in, but they're all dedicated to a certain cause. We also have some social movements, such as the women's movement or the anti-war movement, or this last year Black Lives Matter movement, which transcend borders. You did see protests of Black Lives Matter all around the world. People interacting with the cause, not with another government, right? So another example here will be terror organizations or international terror organizations. They are organized in different countries. They have links between them. They have goals that transcend borders. And they are impacting international politics, of course. Another one of those more nefarious kind of groups are organized crimes, drug cartels, human traffickers, smugglers of all kinds that interact across borders and not between countries. So those are the actors. Now let's think about how the world works. First and foremost, we need to remember that we are still talking about power relations and power politics. If you are more powerful, if you have more economic power, more military power, or more influential power, try to remember we talked at the beginning about hard and soft power. If you have more power, you can get more things done in the world, or things can look like what you want them to look more likely. If you have less power, you have to either find a way to get your interests served, or you have to coordinate with other countries, right? And one thing that we should remember is that international actors, and especially nation states, have interests, and their interests are mainly to survive and to be successful, to be prosperous, right? When we look at international politics and try to understand how the world works, we can use this tool that's called the level of analysis. The level of analysis are 3 levels that try to explain what happens. Say, why did the United States go to war with Iraq in 2003? We can start at the individual level. here we're going to be focusing on the interests and actions of specific individuals, or individuals more broadly speaking. To answer my question from before, we can say that the United States went to war with Iraq because President Bush had a personal grudge against Saddam Hussein, because Saddam Hussein several years before that tried to assassinate his father. That is an explanation on the individual level. But anything, if you look at 9/11 and you explain it by there was this huge leader in Osama bin Laden that was able to mobilize an operation like 9/11, again, you explain things by focusing on an individual. If we are moving up to the next level, we will talk about the state level. And here we will be focusing on the interests and the culture or identity of the country, or look at the power of the country, the indicators, how large, how many people, how rich, how poor, etc. And we are looking at the whole nation state and try to explain whatever happens from that length. So for example, if we are going to say that the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 because our economy relies heavily on energy, on fossil fuel, and Iraq is a producer of oil, you are explaining the invasion from the state level of analysis. And then finally, we can look at the system, at the structure of the system, and how that shapes and constrains the choices decision makers make. So we are saying that decision makers make the decisions that they make because of the structure of the system, because of what the international system looks like, and not because who their father was or what type of economy their country has. So here we need to understand that in international politics we are talking about the anarchical international system. And anarchy means, in this context, a lack of hierarchy. It does not mean chaos. And by a lack of hierarchy, I mean that there is no world government. There is no overarching authority that you can look up to and say, hey, Saddam Hussein is trying to invade Kuwait, or Saddam Hussein is doing something else that's wrong. We dispatch the world police and take care of him? That doesn't exist. We don't have anything like that. Some of you may stand up and say, well, what about the United Nations? The United Nations is an international organization. It's coordinating action between sovereign nation states. It is not a world government. And I'll explain that in a minute, too. So this is the system level. And if we look at the system level and the invasion of Iraq in 2003, we can say that the United States, the superpower, wanted to assert its power in the system to show that we are strong and resolute, and because of that, we had to take action against a possible challenger in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Let's look a bit about international organizations, and let's think about the UN, okay? We need to understand that there is a difference between governance and government. Government is what we have in every nation state. The government makes the law, the government has authorities to enforce the law and implement it, and courts to adjudicate whatever happens. In international relations, we don't have a world government, but we do have governance institutions, such as the UN, or the World Bank, or the International Monetary Fund. What they do is that they help us to coordinate between countries, to coordinate our actions, rather than to, they don't have a hierarchical power, it is just a coordination forum. Now, remember that we believe that all nation states are equally sovereign, which means the government of that nation state has the ultimate power over the territory and the population in it. And therefore, we've also followed this idea of non-intervention. other nation states, other international organizations, other individuals cannot tell France what their tax code should be, or any other domestic policy. And that, again, is true for all countries, small, large, rich, poor, whatever may be. There are exceptions to these rules, and those come usually with gross violation of human rights. We do have international law, but it is limited. It has a limited power. I'm not going to go much in detail about international law right now, but I will say that a lot of times we have those international treaties, those agreements that could look like a legislative process or a legislative decree from the international community. I will only say here that those international treaties, once a country decides to be part of the international law, the international treaty, that diminishes away a little bit of the sovereignty. Not completely, but on that specific area, if we enter an international treaty about women's rights, that means that about women's rights, we are going to match our domestic laws to the minimum requirements in the international agreement. And so that diminishes a little bit or part of our sovereignty. But that has a lot of caveats, and international law more in general is not as strong as how we understand domestic law. Right? Now, international organization has been criticized a lot of time for not being efficient enough, for not doing what they're supposed to do, and there's room for criticism, of course, but also in some issue areas such as human rights, the environment, health, all of those different areas, we do see a lot of successful work by international organizations. Now, what are some topics that we talk about in international politics? We're certainly talking about conflict and war and peace, and nowadays, when we have much less of wars between nation states, much less interstate wars, we're talking about political violence more generally. Intrastate wars, civil wars, terror attacks, insurgency groups, all of those things are studied and learned in international politics. We're talking about international political economy, how protectionist the country is, how much does it use trade barriers, how liberal and open to global trade it is. We're talking about issues of inequality and about international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization that are specifically dealing with international political economy. We're talking about human rights as understood internationally as kind of a baseline of how all people should be treated, and then there are some variations and specific interventions or things that we can do as an international community. Other topics: immigration, transnationalism more in general, the global environment, global health. All of those things are covered when you're studying international politics. Now, the study of international politics is called international relations. Okay, it's a sub-discipline of political science, and this is how we study international politics. And one area of those international politics, of the study of international politics through international relations, or IR, are IR theories. How we understand the world theoretically. And I'm just giving you, again, this is a real quick snapshot of what are some of those theories you may have heard about. Realism, which is this pessimistic idea that we're always going to end up in a situation of power politics, and that we are not going to see any basic change. We're not going to get to a point where we have a world government or a better order. It's just going to continue and be this idea of power politics. Liberalism, which is much more optimistic and find ways to overcome power relations and bring much more cooperation and coordination and collaboration into the system. We have constructivism, which is a theory that focuses on human agency, meaning that we can make change if we want to make change. Remember that realism and liberalism, as I said before, focus more about the structure of the system and this idea that in the system that we have without a world government, we can't see much more than power politics in the case of realism. Constructivism say, yes, this is true as long as we keep the same system, but with human agency, with people deciding to do things differently, we can. And of course, there's a whole lot of family of other theories, critical theories, that look at international relations and think in terms of the haves and have-nots, or the geopolitical north versus the geopolitical south, or in terms of how we understand international politics and how we might be able to understand international politics differently. And so I hope that this has been an informative entry into this world of international politics, and that you find it at least somewhat exciting and interesting. We'll talk more this week about international politics, and your assignment for this week is in a discussion forum that's doing news analysis in a similar way we've done before, but this time I want you to focus on stories that have to do with international politics and not just politics more in general. So enjoy the rest of the material this week, and I will see you on our Zoom sessions.